So we are in a weird time in the generation, okay? Because it looks like there's a strong possibility that for the first time in a long time, I don't even know when the last time this would be maybe turn of the century. For the first time in a long time, we very likely will see a split in the console generation timelines. What does that mean? It means that we probably have the next generation of Xbox consoles a year or two before the PlayStation 6. And that's crazy because traditionally they release alongside each other, and it makes it easier for like multi-plat developers because they can be like, okay, the power levels will be roughly the same. So if we're developing Call of Duty for PlayStation and Xbox, we basically can achieve the same things roughly. It's just on two different platforms. But in terms of power and everything, they're roughly the same. But what's being claimed is that the next Call of Duty 22, sorry, I guess not technically the next Call of Duty for 2026 is being developed for the next generation of Xbox. It's been claimed that Call of Duty 2026, which is assumed to be another Modern Warfare title, is in development for the next generation Xbox. That's according to reputable Call of Duty leaker, The Ghost of Hope, who took to X, formerly Twitter. I find it funny they still have to write formerly Twitter, to break the news after it was announced that Season 3 of Black Ops 6 would be delayed until April. According to Hope, the 2026 title is not being developed for past generation consoles, unlike Call of Duty 2025. So they're going to drop Xbox One and PS4 finally, and is being developed for the next generation of Xbox. So still technically cross-generational. Isn't that funny? Clever. If true, this could be our first real hint that the next gen Xbox could release around fall of 2026. Also pointed out by Hope is that apparently if Verdansk does not bring players back to Call of Duty Warzone, a third game in the free-to-play Battle Royale will not release. So a lot is hinging on Verdansk. Officially, Activision nor Microsoft have released any information on Call of Duty 2026 or even Call of Duty 2025 at this point in time, but according to our sources, the next game in the Call of Duty franchise is a Black Ops 2 sequel headed once again by Treyarch, following rough internal decisions that saw Sledgehammer Games wanting to develop their own fully fledged Call of Duty title for 2027. As always, take such rumors with a grain of salt. But Call of Duty 2026 being in development for the next-gen Xbox consoles is an interesting tidbit of information, if true. Specifically, this Ghost of Hope individual has a history of releasing a bunch of accurate information, specifically with Call of Duty. So there's a strong chance that this is actually being said to him. But why this is really interesting is because in order to develop your game for the next generation Xbox console, there has to be a next generation Xbox console. And it has to be out for people to play it. And Call of Duty typically comes out in November, which would mean that the console, if this were a launch title for it, would probably be out in like November, which would be crazy because we know that PlayStation is looking probably more like 2027, 2028 before we get the PlayStation 6. The PS5 Pro was their mid-gen refresh, and that, you know, if it's truly mid-gen, that means another like 4 years, which would put it 2028 for the next gen. So you could by late 2026 be in a spot where Xbox has far and away the most powerful console on the market, which would be very, very interesting, because then what you'll see is like a shift in a lot of these multi-platform marketing cycles and plans, because a lot of these devs will then have to shift and start really prioritizing like marketing through Xbox, because if they want their game to look the best that it can on console, they're going to do their trailers on Xbox platforms. It's why having the most powerful console, or at least a version of your console that's the most powerful console, is important for marketing. Because even now, like there were whole stories on Monster Hunter where it's like, yeah, if you're going to play Monster Hunter on console, the best place is PS5 Pro. You'd hope so. It's the most expensive console. It better be the best place to play. But nonetheless, that's a ton of extra marketing dollars. That's a ton of extra earned media. That's a ton of people potentially buying a PS5 Pro just to get access to that. It wouldn't be a surprise to me if that actually starts to move the needle a little bit. And it also, I mean, there's the other story where, of course, the rumors are that Xbox is working on a handheld as well. Maybe that materializes. Maybe this is the handheld. Probably not, because they're describing it as next generation. But we know they're working on that. We've also heard like rumblings that Xbox was investigating doing adaptive triggers as well, and maybe that's a feature that they bring similar to the PS5, but they bring it to the next generation of Xbox controllers as well. So it might just be one of those things where Xbox is like, yeah, this gen didn't light the world on fire, but now we've got a lot of games coming. So let's now, with our whole library and Game Pass, let's launch the next era of hardware and just hit the ground running. You know, and maybe they do their mid-gen refresh when PS5 moves to PS6. And so maybe they do it that way. But the point is, all this gets really, really weird if these consoles get staggered. It gets really, really, really weird because historically they always launch around the same time, and then you get to choose which console you want, PlayStation or Xbox. And that's, you buy the one that you and your friends are going to play on, and you're going to make your commitment at that point. But maybe Xbox's plan is just like, hey, if people are going to keep choosing PlayStation over Xbox, why go head to head if we don't need to? Maybe instead we just release our next gen console a year or two before they do, and we just get to chill all alone. Devs would hate that. No. If they're dropping Xbox Series X and S mandated support, then I don't think devs hate it. It'll just make it so like developing your game means that you have a ton of extra headroom if you're going to bring it to Xbox. I think devs would be fine with that. The problem would be if they release this next gen Xbox and then they specifically say that like, oh yeah, you also still have to launch on the Series S. Then it becomes a big headache, I think, because it's like, oh my God, we still have to deal with that. Okay. Then I think it's a headache. But I think if they are able to do this in a way that is specifically trying to move forward and raise the ceiling on performance, then I think devs will be fine with it. What was interesting about this is that Juicehead, YouTuber that covers like a lot of RPGs, like Bethesda, stuff like that, he said one of the big reasons I think we could see Elder Scrolls 6 in 2026 is if there is a push internally for it to be a launch title for the next gen Xbox. That seems like a marketing deal for Xbox. And I understand the sentiment, because the idea is if they can get ES6 out in like November or December of 2026, it's a launch title for the next generation Xbox. It's probably exclusive to that hardware, at least for 6 months or so. And that actually could move copies. If you have Call of Duty and Elder Scrolls 6 as exclusives for that platform, I think that does help move a lot of copies. I mean, never underestimate the power of Elder Scrolls. But is this realistically what's possible? Based on my understanding of Bethesda's development practices, I would be shocked if they were able to do that. Because we had, like, if we draw out our little timeline, let's go 2011, okay? 2011, you have Elder Scrolls, sorry, I'm out of practice, 5 Skyrim. 2015, you have Fallout 4. So this is only a 4-year gap. That's not that bad, right? So it's a tight turnaround, but this was also like late 2011, late 2015 when it actually launched, but still 4 years, that's doable. And then 2018, we had, of course, Fallout 76, and this has kind of changed over the years, because when it initially launched and was a disaster, you heard a lot of like Bethesda defenders saying, no. This was done by Bethesda Game Studios Austin, a separate team. The Maryland studio didn't really work on it. But later, we actually heard many interviews and many discussions of how the Maryland team did a ton of work on Fallout 76. So, you know, they weren't just working on Starfield like for this whole time from 2015 through 2023. They were actually doing a ton of work on Fallout 76. So, like, it wasn't actually true that you know, this was a totally isolated thing. So that actually helps with this argument, though, because that means in 2023, we got Starfart. And So they spent about 5 years realistically working on Starfield in full. I mean, they were doing some work back here as well. Of course, there were some leaks around this time of early production work that was happening, but full production started after 2018 when the team fully freed up. And then that leads us to, of course, Elder Scrolls 6, which is somewhere. Realistically, 2026, only 3 years. You know, if we put it like right here, that would be really, really surprising. They are bigger than they've ever been. They are like, they have more money than they ever have, but that's not been the bottleneck for Bethesda. The bottleneck for Bethesda has been that for some reason they have massive inefficiencies within their company. And we've seen that with the discussions of the devs, where, for example, we watched on stream, we saw some of the devs talking about this. So Will Shen, who was in a bunch of the marketing materials for Starfield, he's gone. He left. He's at another team. He's doing his other thing. And this is what's so fascinating. This whole talk is basically one gigantic breakdown of things that weren't working quite right at Bethesda. And I mean, they make it out like, as you can see here, I'll let him introduce the slide here. I'll let him describe it.
So by the time we ship Starfield, we have grown even more, probably by about the same amount from Fallout 4 to Fallout 76, as you can see here. Well over 500 people, but also we are now working with a large number of external groups, well over a dozen. And these groups are doing everything from effects, lighting, they're working on tools programming, systems programming, pretty much everything. And they have to all be integrated into the development team for the work they are doing. And another part of this is these are external groups, each with their own culture, each with their own leadership, and they are being brought in at various times throughout production, sometimes early on, sometimes to finish it.
Isn't that crazy? Like, isn't that insane? Look how much they'd grown. And yet you wouldn't think, based on the final outcomes and volume of content, the efficiency of fixes and all that, you would not assume that like Starfield had this many devs compared to these other games. It feels like their output has actually dropped since like Fallout 4, and yet they have way more people. Too many cooks? I think it's a lot of cooks, and I think it's also a lot of bureaucracy, and that's kind of what he goes through in this talk. Department over project. He talks about the need for approvals, for layers of double checks from various producers and stuff. And he's like, it's just really inefficient. And this is something that we've also talked about a bajillion times with the CDPR talk, this one.
Areas and pieces of content.
About how they fixed those problems, because that was the exact same problem they had at CDPR, which led to the drama of Cyberpunk 2077's launch, where it was just super broken. There were tons of inefficiencies in the dev cycles because they grew before they grew the infrastructure for handling how many people they had. So they redid it and instead focused on cross-functional teams where they had members of each individual department that could individually work on their own sections of the game, or in this case, Phantom Liberty. And it led to greater efficiency. And that's why you play Phantom Liberty and it feels like it's already such a massive step up from like even the base game in terms of how much they were able to put together and how quickly they were. The big set pieces, the boss fights, everything was totally overhauled. And I think that BGS needs an overhaul like this to get to a level of efficiency that they really need. But that's the thing is, if we're looking at a 2026 release date for Elder Scrolls 6, I think we're dealing with, like, you would have to have seen this overall happen. You would have to see their efficiency go up, because bear in mind, between 2023 and 2024, they released Shattered Space in 24, which was roundly panned by critics and players alike for being short, for lacking significant new content, and for basically just being a slight continuation of the base game with nothing really fresh and a bunch of other stuff that was broken. And they added the rover too. They added a rover. I'll give them credit for that. But they spent a year doing all of that. And obviously, like, it's not their whole team working on that, but you would think if they had an entire year, they could do more. especially when you remember that after Fallout 4, within a single year, they had put out the Far Harbor expansion, they had put out the Nuka World expansion, all the other little DLC. Back here, they did that's the worst arrow I've ever drawn. Back here, they did way more in terms of volume of content, just in that time period, compared to what they were able to do after Starfield. Despite back here, the number of people working on those DLCs and expansions was tiny compared to what they have for Starfield now, which is this massive operation. And so I think for Starfield, the key problem is inefficiencies. And that's something reflected in these talks that they give, and the devs that have left have described. They leave, and of course they're friendly and amicable, and they'll talk about the amazing people that are there and their friends because they worked at the place and they like the people there. But you don't do an hour-long talk at GDC where primarily you're outlining like all the frustrations and difficulties you had. Like, there's a lot of material in here outlining all of this, and it's fascinating to look at. Large teams silo and need project-centered goals. Yeah, it's basically a breakdown of why the mismanagement led to inefficiencies, and it's a fascinating talk. But I mean, for Elder Scrolls 6 to come out in 2026, I think they would need to do a major overhaul of how they actually work and how they develop and how they go through these layers of refinement and polish and stuff, and I just don't frankly see it. I think there's a strong chance we see Elder Scrolls 6 like 2027, maybe 2028. I think that's a stretch, but possible. 4 years, I think, is the minimum for Elder Scrolls 6. Maybe we get another trailer or something, you know, around the launch of whatever that new hardware is. But if they could get Elder Scrolls 6 out in 3 years, I don't think it would be the game that we would be hoping for. I think a BGS game in the modern day, with their modern teams and everything, a BGS game that's only been cooking for 3 years, I think is very underbaked. I would love to be wrong. I would love for them to blow me away and come out with a monster project, and they just figured out all their efficiencies. They're just brimming with, or what was it? Glowing with style and confidence. I would love that. But for them to hit that 2026 release date would mean that they basically turn the game around in 3 years. And if you're looking at the sheer number of developers they have, you'd think maybe that's possible, because you're like, hey, back in the day, you had Skyrim developed with this many people. So if we have this many people now, if we had this many people with Skyrim, and we just need to do that again, but in the modern day, with this many people, we should be able to do it 3 times as fast, right? Well, unfortunately, that's not how that works. But, you know, their efficiency has gone down, or at least stayed the same, you know, if you're being super generous. But it seems like they just do not work anywhere near as dynamically as they used to. Anyway, I appreciate the optimism, and I understand what Juicehead's saying, where he thinks it could make sense if they really wanted to push it for 2026. I just think a Bethesda project in 2026 would be very underbaked based on what I've seen from their capabilities, but I guess time will tell.